All right. So um, the next piece of our lecture is on language development. And language development has four overarching or larger pieces to it. There's the sounds we make, there's the words we make, there's grammar and how we put sentences together. And then there's the unwritten rules of language, which are what we call pragmatics. But let's talk from the top. So the first piece of language or component of language development is phonology. The root of phonology is a phoneme. A phoneme is a distinct sound that's connected to a given language. At birth, we could make any sound for any language in the world. However, by the age of 1, we already have eliminated sounds that are not relevant to our language that we're going to be speaking, our native language, right? So in English, there are 40 distinct speech sounds. There are sounds in other languages that we don't use in English. For example, the rolling R in Spanish, carro, right? Or the guttural h or sound in the Semitic languages of Hebrew and Arabic, right? So there are different languages that have phonemes or sounds that are not connected to the English language, but we're able to distinguish between sounds that have meaning and sounds that don't have meaning. And this is what we call categorical perception. So we can discern through meaningful sounds, right? So the first thing you're going to see are sounds or things like that. Um, Not a full word, but you're going to have a progression. And I'm not, haven't gotten there yet, but we make booing, then babbling, and then we have something called expressive jargon, and then we say our first words. But semantics are the words we actually say. And semantics refers to understanding the meaning of words. And we typically say our first word around 12 months as well. I know we talked about motor development and walking was at 12 months. But so same thing with saying our first word. And some people will say their first word a little bit earlier. Some people will say it a little bit later. But by 18 months, if there's no discernible language or words, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends an assessment for autism, right? So that's one of the assessments. You could also do a hearing test because we see it's certainly harder for people to pick up language when they have chronic ear infections or even if they have poor hearing to begin with. So we rule out some problems by 18 months. But okay, the words we say. Typically, the words that children have in their initial word bank are things that are very near and dear to them. So a first word might be something like mama, baba, dada, something like that, which is repeat of a single syllable, right? It's a basic word. Uh, it's also a word that is necessary for communication. Other things might be ball or something like that, but in general, the first words are uh, things that are meaningful and in the child's environment. Now, we also need to understand conceptually semantics is the ability to distinguish between words or understand the meaning of words, right? So obviously, our first words are the initial word bank, but as we get into a larger word bank, we have to be able to distinguish between um, events versus categories. So becoming a mother versus being a woman, right? So uh, not all women become mothers, right? So that is an example of understanding the relationship and the distinctness of each word, right? So each word has some meaning to it. Now, how we take words and string them into sentences, that also matters, right? So the syntax is the process of putting words together. Now, you probably have seen the word syntax in uh, another context. So if you are a mathematician and you punch a bunch of numbers and processes into a calculator, and it makes no sense to the calculator, you will hear it say syntax error, or you won't necessarily hear it. You'll read syntax error, right? Same thing with the way we string words together to make sentences. We string them together in a meaningful way. And we could have a syntax error even in language development. For example, I'll show you a syntax, and it's just two words. It's not a full sentence, right? You can understand what the meaning of the sentence is. So if I were to be a young child and I were to say to a caregiver, want cookie, what would that possibly mean to you? Want cookie. Anyone?
Wants a cookie.
Yeah, they're asking for a cookie, right? So when you have a noun and a verb, a noun and an adjective, you can understand what the child is saying because the syntax makes sense. Or big boo boo, right? If a child says that, big boo boo, right? They're saying that they got hurt. But when you string words together in an unintelligible way, that that's different. That's a syntax error, right? So let me give you a two-word sentence which is harder to discern. Ball sky. Ball sky. Anyone know what that kid is saying if they say ball sky?
The sun.
So they might be describing the sun, right? Because it's spherical in nature. Is there anything else a child might be saying?
There
What
might
else?
be a balloon in the sky.
Say it again.
There might be a balloon in the sky.
Okay, there might be a balloon in the sky similar to the sun. Um, Anything else? Could it be that they're playing baseball and they hit the ball into the sky? Or so could they be playing football and so the ball is falling from the sky, right? So we could have a description of an object or it could be a process, but we won't know, right? Because ball sky, when you put two nouns together without any context, it's harder to discern. So you'll see we're going to talk about something called telegraphic speech, which is how we put a series of words together before we make full sentences, right? So we might say two-word sentences or three-word sentences, but typically the two and three-word sentences we say use a noun and a verb and an adverb, um, a noun and an adjective. These are a lot easier to discern than just two nouns. All right. So we went from sounds to words to sentences. Related to syntax, there is an element called grammar, right? Grammar does impact the meaning of sentences as well. So if we want to make a possessive, or we want to make something in past tense or present tense, that's going to alter what is being said in a sentence. So that's also linked to syntax, or some people teach grammar as a separate domain altogether. But the last piece of language development is pragmatics of language. Now, pragmatics of language are basically the unwritten rules of language that allow us to make meaning of sentences, right? Because I could say the same sentence in many different ways, and depending on how I emphasize a word, it alters the meaning. So Tony Robbins, which is a motivational speaker, talked about this. He said, be careful how you speak and what words you put emphasis on, because it changes how it's experienced by other people. So let's take this sentence on the slide and play around with it a little bit. I didn't beat my wife, right? So if someone says that, the emphasis on I might imply someone else did. I didn't beat my wife, right? So that's like a proper denial. The emphasis is on the not doing something. I didn't beat my wife, right? So emphasis on beat would imply that maybe something else happened. I didn't beat my wife, right? So my would emphasize uh, or suggest perhaps it was someone else's. Or I didn't beat my wife, right? Emphasis on wife could imply maybe someone else, right? So this is an example that he uses, a simple sentence, and something like emphasis changes how we understand the same sentence. One of the problems with text message is that we don't get tone, right? So I am sure some of you might have had conflict with a friend, a family member, romantic partner, due to reading a sentence and misunderstanding their tone, misunderstanding what they're actually trying to say, because things do get lost. The aspect of pragmatic language is not there. So some people will put emojis to clue a person in, right? Because we can't listen for tone, we can't listen for sentiment in a text message. Now, if you did a voice message, maybe we could, right? But so that's one issue. How about sarcasm? Sarcasm is another uh, piece of language, right? So it's another piece of pragmatic language. So yeah, sure you did, right? When you say something like that, it's a skeptic tone, right? Even though you said, yeah, sure you did, um, because of the tone, you're picking up sarcasm, right? Or sometimes we'll say a Einstein, right? So, and it might be meaning the exact opposite, right? Where um, we're actually mocking, right? So, in pragmatic language, it's how you say the words, it's the context of the words that allow us to understand what's happening. There's also something called elocutionary content, where we're actually making a request in the form of a statement. So it's not meant to be literal. So if I were to say, the phone is ringing, right? And I were to tell you the phone is ringing, I would expect you to pick up the phone, right? Or say, hey, could you pick up the phone? It would not be a declaration that the phone is ringing. So if you were to say, yeah, I hear the phone ringing, and do nothing, that would not be uh, what I'm saying. Or if I were to say, hey, the garbage is starting to smell, what I'm really asking is, hey, could you take out the garbage, right? So there are certain aspects of language that go beyond the sentences we use. Now, there is another piece of pragmatic language which is important, which are our nonverbals. We understand the meaning of what people are saying to us by other things, by facial expressions, by body language, and so forth. So part of language is, our nonverbals. So if we are saying something with a scowl on our face, it's going to be perceived more angrily than if we're saying something with a smile on our face, which might be perceived as more playful or happy, right? So that's pragmatics. Interesting to note, when it comes to autism spectrum disorders, language development is a challenge. And we see about 50% of people on the autism spectrum remain nonverbal, right? So they don't speak. That doesn't mean they don't communicate, but they remain nonverbal. And even individuals who acquire language struggle with pragmatics, the social cues, the nonverbals, the sarcasm. A good example is if you watch Big Bang Theory, right? Sheldon is a main character, and he has to be told when there's sarcasm because he doesn't pick it up, right? There's this lack of understanding of social rules of language. So that's language development. Now, let's talk about another thing, baby talk, right? So motherese is a term for baby talk. And the question is, do babies prefer baby talk, or do they prefer a person to speak to them as an adult? And if you don't have children, you might say, oh, I'm going to speak to my child properly and I'm going to speak to them like they're an adult and so forth. But most people report that they go to speak in, greater emphasis. There's speaking slowly. There's exaggerating the distinction between words. So there's changes in volume. All of these are designed to help a baby acquire language, right? So motherese was a term coined in language development for baby talk, right? So um, parents do it all the time. The question is, do babies actually like it? Well, Fernald did a research study in which they examined this. And they did preferential looking by the amount of head turns that an infant did to a speaker. So they had one speaker where the sounds coming out of the speaker were motherese or baby talk, and then another speaker where it was just normal speech. And what they found was there was greater time spent looking at the speaker that had motherese, right? So that demonstrated that infants preferred motherese versus normal speech. And they also did one where they had motherese versus like random or awkward pauses. And once again, the infants preferred motherese over random breaks or pauses. So it's a really cool study that suggests that maybe baby talk is a good thing. Maybe because we're slowing down our speech and we're increasing emphasis and we're exaggerating tone to keep the baby's attention, maybe that facilitates language acquisition. So that was the research and that was the position that was found. So when you have a child, don't feel like you have to talk to them as adults, even though they're babies, right? Um, Speak to them with the goo goo gaga and all of that stuff because it's helpful to them. All right. So I said to you that there is a process by which we communicate, right? So how do we progress to our first words, right? So it starts with joint attention. So we see that there are actual feeding dialogues. Even immediately after birth, parents will hold their baby and feed them, and they will look into their eyes. And what that will teach the child is that eye contact is important when engaging in a conversation. It is much harder to connect with a person if they're not making eye contact or if they're not sustaining eye contact, right? So the first thing that happens are these feeding dialogues, this eye contact. And then we have actual sounds. So there's cooing and babbling. Cooing happens slightly before babbling. And as I described, it's the repetition of vowel sounds. So if a baby coos, you're going to hear them say ooh 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 ooh, right? So any number of the vowel sounds, and they're going to do it repetitively. Now, cooing starts first, then babbling occurs. Babbling is when you have a consonant added to it. So remember which is the A vowel. Babbling would add a consonant. So you might hear a baby say ba 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 ba, right? And that occurs as early as 3 months, right? So they're adding vowels and consonants together. And that's interesting, right? So being able to practice the sounds of a language are important. Now, between the ages of 3 months to 12 months, I said you say your first word typically at about 1 year, right? We see something called expressive jargon. Now, expressive jargon is a process where the baby sounds like they're engaging in a real conversation. It sounds like they're trying to say something. Now, the words or sounds are not uh, understood to those around them, but it mimics the sound of a conversation. So you might hear a baby in the back in their car seat saying blah 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 blah, and it doesn't make sense to you, but they're mimicking how to talk. They're mimicking the rise and fall of a language. They're practicing stringing sounds together to make sentences, right? So we see this happen even before first words. Now, what about people who are hearing impaired or deaf? We see that they babble. There's an early research study in the 1960s that demonstrated at at early infancy we see babbling even with deaf children. Now what happens is the babbling gets switched to signing, right? So if you have a person with a hearing impairment, they if they can't speak and hear you, they will engage in sign language. And what we see with infants learning sign language, they will babble with their hands. So, what does that mean? They will engage in pre sign language, and it will look like they're trying to do sign language, but it's unintelligible as well. So, expressive jargon or this longer version of babbling happens in both people who have normal hearing and in the hearing impaired. Okay, so at about 1 year old, you're going to say your first words. I mentioned this to you already, and usually The child is going to say something that's near and dear to them. So, as I said, mama, dada, baba, right? Anything that is ball, anything that is uh, simple to say, oftentimes either one syllable or a repetition of one syllable. We tend to see that's what is said first. Now, they may understand more words than they actually use, but you'll see that in general, the expression of language is uh, below or behind the understanding of language. So when you say your first word, you might understand about 50 words, right? So your word bank is larger than what you're expressing. Now, I mentioned the concept of telegraphic speech. So, telegraphic speech is two or more words, not full sentences, though, where a person is trying to convey an idea. I talked to you about telegraphic speech as part of the syntax of language. And in order to understand what a child is trying to say, oftentimes it's noun verbs, noun adjective, verb adverb. Um, these are a lot easier to understand than two nouns, right? By 2.5 to 3 years old, children are starting to put together longer sentences. They're starting to be able to convey ideas in a fuller context. However, because the children are still novices as it relates to language, they do make mistakes. This is what we call errors of growth, right? Where they apply a category either too broadly or too narrow. So um, let's say the word doggy, right? So doggy is meant to be a distinct animal, but if a child says every fuzzy animal is a doggy, well, they're overusing, right? That's an overextension going beyond the actual word. So they're doing it too broadly, right? And then the opposite can happen too, where the person uses a word for a specific type and to the exclusion of others that might be in the category. So a teddy bear is only this type of bear. Or if you were ever a babysitter, you might have gotten this from a kid where you want to put them to bed and they're like, I want I need a blanket, right? So you get them whatever blanket you could see, and they're like, that's not a blanket. And you're like, yes, it is. But in their mind, they're saying only my blanket is a blanket, right? So they're being too rigid or restrictive or too narrow with the word, right? So things like blankets or teddy bears, whatnot. Now, what's really, really impressive is that between the ages of 2 to 6 years old, we have a rapid growth in language acquisition. On average, we see that uh, children are acquiring 9 words per day. And at 2 years old, they might have a word bank of about 500 words. By about 6 years old, they have a word bank of about 14,000 words. And that's impressive, right? 14,000 distinct words. If they understand that, they have largely mastered the language. Yes, they're going to still need to understand grammar and exceptions to rules and how to make essays and paragraphs, and all of that's going to happen during grade school. But the acquisition of language, the understanding of language, um, is largely mastered by 5 or even at the latest 6. Um, so that's our progression. Now, I would tell you before I move on to the debate how we acquire language, I would tell you that by about 11, we have over 40,000 words we understand, right? So that's pretty impressive when you think about it, because if I were to ask you to write a 14,000 or a 40,000 uh, word paper, you would not be happy, right? Because uh, each page is 250 words. So think about it. You would have to write for 14, roughly 50, uh, 56 page paper, right? So you understand 14,000 words by the age of 5 or 6, but that doesn't mean you're putting 14,000 words on paper. But imagine you could, as a child, say, I understand this word, and you string it up. It would be 56 full pages as if you were writing sentences of words. And then by um, about 11, it's 160 pages worth, right? Because it's about 40,000 words. Pretty impressive. Now, the question, remember our earlier debate, nature versus nurture. There is a debate as to how we acquire language. Well, B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist, and we'll talk about behaviorism in its own lecture. But I want to bring in B.F. Skinner because he felt that language was acquired like all other behavior, and it was acquired through experience. So he wrote a book called Verbal Behavior, where he presented his case as to how language is learned through experience. So what he argued it was that it was learned through association, so pairing words together, reinforcement, and reinforcement can be an actual gift, it could be a treat, or it could be praise, right? So uh, parents get super excited when their kids start saying stuff. It could be shaping, where the parent is gently guiding the kid towards acquiring language, or it could be imitation, where they hear something and they repeat it. And we know that you have to be careful with your children because whatever you say, they will repeat it, right? So that's Skinner, right? Now, the problem with Skinner is that it's highly impractical. According to researchers, you would have to spend all day, every day for the first 6 years of life doing these processes of reinforcement and shaping and imitation in order to fully master this way. So there are others like Noam Chomsky who says, that's not true, right? So, how do we acquire language? He says we have an innate process, which I'm going to explain to you shortly. He said behaviorism, the process by which Skinner is arguing language has occurred is pretty sterile, and he said it's really not true. So, um, you couldn't spend all that time reinforcing and modeling and shaping behavior. So, as I said, he says perhaps the ability to acquire language is innate, not necessarily that we have all the words. We do need experience, but the reason why humans can speak and communicate the way we do is we're wired. There's a part in the mind that allows us to do this, right? And there are other things that Chomsky criticized Skinner for, right? He said, well, not everything is um, reinforced, right? So there is something called transformational grammar, right? So how we string words together impacts their meaning. And we see young children will put sentences together that they never even heard, right? So they're it's transformative, right? Well, and he says, as I said, language can't just be learned through imitation. And if you were to think of great writers, people like William Shakespeare, well, William Shakespeare added over 500 words to the dictionary, words that did not exist. So, how could it be that if it's modeled or it's reinforced, you wouldn't be able to create new language, create new slang, if not for the uh, internal processes, right? And it's also creative, right? So what when you read William Shakespeare's writings, they have a distinct tone. And if you compare William Shakespeare to even Grisham, right? I'm intentionally picking someone else who does like law-based novels. The writing sounds very different. So, how is it that Grisham sounds the way he does in his style of writing, and Shakespeare sounds the way he does? Well, it there is this creative process, there is this uniqueness. So we all have the same words, but how we put those words together into sentences, paragraphs, and essays and stories is novel, is new, is creative. And he says Skinner fails to capture all of that. Now, if it's not just due to reinforcement, how does it work? Now, Chomsky proposed something called the LAD, the language acquisition device, which is a part of the mind that allows infants to hear and process sounds. Now, you'll notice I'm using the word mind instead of brain. Chomsky did not identify or say, hey, it's this part of the brain or that part of the brain. It's a conceptual language acquisition device, right? But neuroscientists would agree, right? Because we have Broca's area and Wernicke's area, as we talked about in an earlier lesson, right? So when it comes to language, there are brain regions involved. So there is some support for the language acquisition device from neuroscience. So let's look at some of the arguments that are in favor of Chomsky. Now, Chomsky, if we're doing nature versus nurture, Skinner was on the nurture side of the argument. Chomsky's on the nature side of the argument. Nature, when we say you're born with it, it's fairly universal, right? So, what Chomsky noticed and other researchers noticed is that regardless of the language, you're going to see a process of cooing, then babbling, then words, and then sentences as a whole. Doesn't matter the language, it occurs in that sequence. And even deaf babies babble. So it's clear that we're wired for speech, right? We also see that there are windows of time which we refer to as sensitive periods where learning is supposed to take place. And if it doesn't take place, it's going to affect the development. Now, when you take a developmental psychology course, you're going to learn the distinction between critical period versus sensitive period. So I do want to talk about that briefly, and it will resurface. A critical period is something that's all or none. If the learning doesn't occur in a window of time, it won't occur at all. And for many animal models, that is the case, right? However, when it comes to human beings, we have something called a sensitive period. So it's a less absolute version of this concept of a critical period. So, in a sensitive period, as we describe it, is a window of time in which a process is supposed to be learned or acquired. If it doesn't happen in that time, the learning will be stunted or interrupted. So, let's talk about isolates, right? There are people who were left in the wild and without interaction with others. There are people who are locked away. And the common case that's presented in most psychology textbook is the case of Jeannie. And Jeannie was locked in the basement for um, the first decade plus of her life. Now, I said the sensitive period for language is the first 6 years of life, typically, right? But she was locked away um, maybe 12 years or so. And then she was discovered. And when she was discovered, she had no use of language whatsoever. And psychologists tried to work with her to teach her language, right? And they worked with her for about 4 years until the mom requested they stop. And Jeannie never fully mastered language, right? In fact, we estimate that she acquired language maybe to the age of 2 to 3 years old. So they spent 4 years to get her to a point of maybe telegraphic speech. So that gives you uh, the impact, right? So according to Skinner, if it's just modeling and reinforcement, who cares when it happens, right? But that's not the case because Jeannie never fully mastered language because she was learning language outside of the sensitive period for language acquisition, right? So that's a pretty powerful piece of evidence that we're wired for language. And if there's severe deprivation, it does affect our development, right? So that's a strong argument against Skinner. Now, we also have people who have brain damage. So if you have damage to Broca's area, you're going to struggle with speech and language production. You're going to struggle with things like grammar. Um, and if you have damage to Wernicke's area, you're going to struggle with speech and language comprehension. Just a reminder where these are in the brain. I know we talked about this. Broca's area is in the frontal lobe. Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe, right? So we have all this evidence, and perhaps one of the more powerful pieces of evidence is that it's a distinct ability that human beings have, right? So we tried as researchers to train chimps, train bonobo chimps to learn language. And what we found was that, sure, we could use a picture book and teach a chimp to have some basic understanding of what objects are. But, and if we gave instruction, they might understand some aspects, right? So if I were to say, take this potato outside, they would understand what to do. Or if I were to say that take the potato outside and bring it in, they would understand what to do. So there was some language acquisition, but once again, nothing more than uh, uh, maybe a 3-year-old level, right? So that even chimps, which are the closest to us, never fully understood language. They didn't understand it, and certainly they could not produce language. They, you might say, oh, but that's linked to the vocal cords. Well, we taught signing, which doesn't require vocalization. And even with signing, chimps only learned basic signing. So they didn't fully acquire language. So, in fact, we argue that humans are the only animal model that has uh, an evolved language. Now, you might say that's not true. I've heard parrots. Well, parrots speak. Well, they have the vocalization, but parrots are not spontaneous in their language. And if you tried to have a conversation with a parrot, they would engage in something called echolalia. They would just repeat back to you what you're saying. They wouldn't actually answer the question. So if I were to say to a parrot, "How are you doing?" They might say, "How are you doing?" And they would just repeat it back to me. Or you might say, "How was your day?" The parrot's not going to tell you all the things they did in their day. So parrots don't have full language. Chimps don't have full language. The one promising area which might disprove what I'm saying at one point or another in time are dolphins. It's unclear to us whether dolphins have their own intricate language. We're not ruling it out, but we haven't cracked the code to their click noises and whether or not they mean something consistent and distinct. So, as it stands, there's a great deal of support for this idea that humans are wired for language. We're wired for it. And that's important, right? So, who's right? Skinner or Chomsky? The reality is, it's the same answer I told you when I introduced the debates of nature versus nurture. Both are right. We need, in general, the wiring, the language acquisition device. We need the brain structures in order to be able to acquire language. We need them to function. However, we also need exposure to language. So the combination of the two is what allows for proper language acquisition. So it's not one or the other, it's a combination of the two. So, and what's interesting is Skinner and Chomsky really did not like one another. And story goes that when they were presenting their research, the other one would sit in their conference presentation and challenge them, interrupt them in a way that was, pretty off-putting. So where they took their battle lines, today we're saying, okay, it's kind of silly, the battle lines they drew. I also want to talk to you about emotion development, right? Because how do we communicate other than with words, right? So in infancy, one of the most important things that infants can do is cry. And crying is a way for infants to convey their needs, right? So you can convey you're hungry, you can convey you're tired, you can convey that you're frustrated, you could convey that you need a diaper change, you could convey that you're in pain. Now, if we listen to the type of cry, it tells the story, and parents pick up on this pretty early. So the classic wow, 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 that's your basic cry. That's usually linked to being hungry or needing to be changed. But when you have a baby that groans with that deeper cry, that's usually linked to frustration or anger. So we pick that cry up. And we also can pick up pain, because pain usually you have a wind up and there's that high pitched shrill sound that indicates pain, right? So that high pitch cry is usually pain. Now, another interesting finding is that by about 2 months, and I know I talked about Eric Erickson and addressing the needs of your child for trust versus mistrust. But infants are little scientists exploring their environment. And when they cry, they start to pick up that, hey, that gets my caregiver's attention. Hey, that gets my caregiver to come to me, right? So by as early as the second month of life, infants know that crying is a technique to convey their needs. They learn it, they use it effectively. We also have smiling. Smiling is another basic expression of emotion in infancy. Now, you'll see babies will smile pretty undifferentiated at birth. They'll smile at everything, anything, any change of stimulus. But by 5 months, they start to recognize patterns in their environment. They start to recognize who the important figures in their life are. So by 5 months, they will smile uh, when familiar people come. So seeing one's mother or father or grandparent, aunt or uncle, right? These faces, because they're more involved in a child's life, they're going to be more likely to produce a smile. Now, another thing that you have to be careful is at birth, there's another reason why babies smile. When they have gas, they smile. So at birth, maybe the child smiling isn't because of you. It could be any change of stimulus, it could be gas, it could be a whole host of things. So that's crying, that's smiling. And then there's fear, right? So when we talk about fear, a fear response at birth is any change in stimulation, change in lighting, change in temperature, change in motion. It creates a fear response. But as we progress into the first year and part of the second year of life, we actually see that there is this process of separation anxiety and stranger anxiety. So, separation anxiety is anxiety that's produced when the child is removed from the presence of their parents or caregivers, right? So, many parents have to work after childbirth and during infancy. So, what do? They might have a babysitter, and it's not uncommon for an infant to cry when a parent or caregiver leaves. And think about this. This also makes sense from a cognitive point of view because of what we said about object permanence. In in infancy and the early phases of toddlerhood, so even up to about 18 months, they're still figuring out object permanence, right? So imagine your loved one disappears. You might not realize that they're coming back. You might think they're gone forever because you don't, or they magically disappeared, right? So you don't realize that they're going to return. So there is that separation anxiety, right? There's also an attachment piece, which I'll get to shortly, but uh, feeling like I don't have my secure base, feeling like I don't know if you're coming back, feeling like maybe you just magically disappeared, that's going to create anxiety linked to separation from parents and caregivers. We also have stranger anxiety. So, stranger anxiety is a recognition, as I said, we recognize who's familiar in our environment. We smile for those familiar people, but we also have an earlier version of stranger danger, right? When we don't know who the person is, it induces anxiety, it induces fear. So, stranger anxiety might occur when I don't know, a coworker comes over the house and the infant hasn't seen this coworker, so they might be triggered with some kind of anxiety response. The good news is it usually goes away by 2 years old, right? By 2 years old, it's largely resolved. Now, there is a disorder called separation anxiety disorder, but we don't typically diagnose separation anxiety disorder until school age because there are some kids who have limited separation from their caregiver, right? So we diagnose something when it's considered developmentally inappropriate, right? So at a young age, we're wired to detect separation and have anxiety. We're able to detect stranger anxiety. We're wired for that. That's a beautiful thing. But we're also supposed to understand the rules of the game by about 5. So now, by the end of the first year, uh, only specific people will trigger or elicit these responses. So a mom or a dad not being there could elicit that separation anxiety, not another person per se. So that is our language piece. I'm gonna stop there and we'll talk about attachment separately.